add some insight.
I think it's sorry? I think it's going to add some opportunities.
I hope so. Yeah. Sounds interesting.
We work with you.
Are you staying until tomorrow?
Just early tomorrow morning, I'll be going back. So.
You might see a little sun before.
What's that? Oh, maybe.
You might see a little sun
before I go.
It's really bad luck.
It's supposed to end today, the rain? Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know if it's supposed to be. I mean, yesterday they were saying it's only going to be today and Sunday, but since it changes every day.
Yeah.
You saw the news this week.
Yeah, it's supposed to be.
I'm just
Yeah,
reading
in Las Vegas, yeah.
Oh,
That's incredible.
Where's Tim? Oh, right there. Okay. Good.
He's moved.
Why don't we get started?
All right, sure.
Welcome, everyone. I know this is not the easiest day to come here, and we have people who are calling in, or video conferencing in. I'm Steve Shepard, Director of the Murphy Institute, and I'm pleased to have with us Julie Hotchkiss, who's the Director of the Atlantis Federal Statistical Data Research Center. Got it all on word.
Yeah.
I think this is a great opportunity for Tulane and for our researchers. And Julie's going to kind of walk us through what's involved, the process. And it's important for us also to make sure that there's interest, broad interest across the campus. So as you go back and talk to your deans and other administrators, make it clear that this is something that is important for you. So we'll have Julie give a presentation. We'll have time for questions and answers, also from the people who are video conferencing in. And I'll turn it over to Julie.
Okay. Thanks. And did you want to do something?
No,
oh, we're good. We're ready. Okay.
One more thing. Laura and I would put this together, so introduce Laura Levy, our Vice President.
Yes.
thank you.
Very good.
Welcome.
Thank you. And y'all get a prize for braving the elements out there. And this is just going to be a broad overview. I'm going to try and give you a flavor for what's available in terms of data through the Federal Statistical Research Data Center network. And there are going to be data that you're particularly interested in and some that I won't know answers to. That's why we have a census employee that actually works with the researchers to develop proposals, but I'll answer what questions I can, definitely. And feel free to ask questions as I go, okay? You have to save them all for the end, okay? We should have plenty of time. And just by way of introduction, my full-time job is as a research economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And some faculty at Georgia State University approached me for the Federal Reserve to join the consortium in developing or building this Atlanta Research Data Center, and they actually wanted to put it in the Atlanta Fed. There were some precedents for this. There's a center in the Chicago Fed that was built some 20-odd years ago, and now we have centers at the Kansas City Fed, and the Philadelphia Fed, and the Dallas Fed. So they're kind of, wherever you see a Fed, I think eventually there'll be an RDC as well. But in addition to that, they're also across the U.S., and you'll see where they're located in a few minutes. I want to start by just telling you, just technically, sort of what an RDC is. Research Data Center are these FSRDCs. They're secure computing labs where qualified researchers conduct approved statistical analysis on non-public data. These are data that are collected by a variety of agencies, government and non-government agencies. The Census Bureau is probably the largest contributor to these data. The National Centers for Health Statistics, the AHRQ, that I don't ever remember what that stands for, but it's more health data. That's where the MEPS data are found. The Social Security Administration, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and all of those folks, and others. The labs are established through an agreement between the federal statistical agencies, primarily the Census Bureau, and a local research community. And the labs are managed by the census, the Center for Economic Studies within the Census Bureau, and it's provided for by 3 statutes. And I think it's important to understand where this came from or how this is allowed legally. Title 13 basically states that the use of data can only be, the data at the Census Bureau by these federal agencies can only be used by sworn officers of the Census Bureau. So if you have a project, feel free to sign in and take the literature, and don't worry about me. You just do what you need to do over there. So whoever has a project becomes a special sworn officer of the Census Bureau, and that takes some process you'll see in a minute. Title 26 allows for other government agencies to share their data with the Commerce Department, which is on top of the Census Bureau, for statistical purposes, and that's kind of important. And then CIPSE, which I don't remember what it stands for, but it basically says you're going to get in a lot of trouble if you don't protect the confidentiality of the data, is what that was about. Here's where all the federal statistical research data centers are located. The ones that are in red are the ones that are going to be opening up this year or next year. And you'll see that we finally got one in Colorado, which was a long time coming. There's this big old hole in the middle of the U.S., and finally they got an RDC. And I know other places that are applying for them. Florida, University of Florida is applying, and various other places are applying for data centers. This graph, I like this graph because it shows you sort of how connected the network is to each other. The nodes represent RDC labs, and the size of the node tells you how many research projects are at that node, and then the connections are joint projects between people, researchers at each one of these nodes, and the thickness of that line is how many projects. So Atlanta and Michigan have more joint projects together than, say, Atlanta and Berkeley. But although they're, anyway, so you can kind of see just how interconnected this network is with each other. The Atlanta Research Data Center is located in the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Lovely picture right there. It's at the corner of 10th and Peachtree Street. And there is a MARTA, a public transportation MARTA station, right behind that part of the building right there. And so basically any researchers who come from out of town, if they're flying in, they at the airport, they hop on MARTA and they go up the North Line and they get out at the Atlanta Fed, and there they are ready to work. There are hotels in the area. A lot of people stay a little further north where the hotels are less expensive, but then they can ride MARTA down to the Atlanta Fed. And these are our current consortium members. In addition to the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, Georgia State University, Georgia Tech, Florida State, University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa, University of Georgia, University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and Emory University are the current consortium members. Now, I want to describe the data that are in the RDCs, which is probably what you all are here to hear about anyway. And the data are grouped into different categories. There's economic data that that have data on firms and establishments, and I'll tell you about some details of each one of those, not all of them. And then the business register data, which is sort of like the backbone of all of the economic data. And then there's some transactions data that are put together from like the Federal Trade Commission, that sort of thing. The demographic data that are available are usually available from various surveys that the Census Bureau undertakes, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, on individuals and households. There are also administrative data from the Social Security Administration, which has become very popular of late. And then this data set gets a category all its own because it is so huge and it is so rich. It is a data on employees linked with employers in the United States. About 98% of all employers and employees are included in this data set. Not all states are available in the RDCs, but this whole LEHD program is huge.
Are you going to discuss the then a little more depth?
Yes, yeah, I am going to go a little bit more in detail. And then there's health data that are provided for through the National Center for Health Statistics. Oh, there you have it, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Two new additions to the RDC environment are data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There are 3 offices that are now up and running and contributing data through the RDCs. So there are data available on occupational injuries and illnesses, fatal occupational injuries, National Compensation Survey, which is I expect will be very popular. Now the National Longitudinal Surveys are already available. Are also available. That's okay. Are already available to researchers on a confidential basis. But they're now being available inside the RDC. They can be linked with other data sets. And then prices and living conditions data is also available. The BEA is it's coming soon. They haven't made their data available yet, but their data is going to include things, information on foreign direct investment and trade and services and intellectual property, both I think domestically and internationally. All right, and again, I'm going to talk to you about some advantages of using these data in the RDC first, and then I'll talk more detail about some of the data products. Here's just a list of some of the benefits that people have found or have from having access to restricted data. There are a vast number of data sets available that are not publicly available at the micro level. So the Census Bureau produces a number of data sets at an aggregate level, such as the Census of Manufacturers, for example. They provide aggregates of revenues or profits or employees at an industry level. But in the RDC, you have access to the actual establishment level data that generated those aggregates. And there's no publicly available version of those micro data. Census data sets can be linked together inside the RDC. So every entity, every firm, establishment whose data come into the RDC are assigned an employee, or it's like an establishment identifier. And it's a unique identifier for that establishment, so that anytime that establishment shows up in any survey in the RDC, they will have the same identifier, and you can link across surveys. Every person's data that enters into the RDCs through some survey, perhaps it's the Survey of Income and Program Participation, or the American Community Survey, or, as we all would be in there, through the Social Security Administration. Every person is provided a personal identification key, which is you can't figure out who it is. There are no names or anything in there. But just from that number, though, is unique to each person whose data might enter the RDC in one form or another, one survey or another, so that you can link data for a single person across different products. Census data sets can be linked to external data. So if you have done a survey, for example, on real estate transactions, and you have data on real estate brokers or companies or something like establishments that you want to bring into the RDC and link up with some other data that might be in there, you can do that. You can bring in outside data and be able to link it up through what's called the business register, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute as well. There are more detailed levels of geographic identifiers. So even for some data that are available at the micro level, so the current population survey or the American Community Survey, at most you can get things at sort of the county level. Inside the RDC, you could go down to the block level, which is a very small geography for individuals. And there's also very little top and bottom coding. So if you're interested in things like income distribution analysis or things like that, you don't have everybody capped at like $200,000. If you make over $200,000 in the public data, you just see $200,000 and a flag. This person was capped. In the RDC, you get to see the full income distribution, and of course with the Social Security Administration data as well. There are a few labs. There's about 30 now. They're growing all the time, which is really good for collaboration. We have a lot of researchers that have collaborators, say in Boston or Michigan, that sort of thing. And you each would be able to access the same project space no matter where the co-author is located. Okay, so it's a network that provides very well for collaboration. I ran across this chart a couple of years ago, and what this chart shows is the share of all published papers, empirical papers in top economics journals, because I'm an economist, so that's why I would be seeing this. The blue bar represents the share of those papers that are published that have exemption from providing your data to the journal for replication issues. And I'll talk about replication in a little bit as well. And the white bar, the white bar gets no exemption. The red bar gets an exemption for using private data. So either private data or non-public data or administrative data have been growing in the representation of empirical papers being published in economics journals anyway. There's a whole host of funding opportunities. The Center for Economic Studies has a very good relationship with the National Science Foundation, and I've got a list of funding opportunities, which actually is not included in, I don't think it's included in the handout. It might be. I'm not sure. Is it at the very end? I can't remember if I included those or not. No, you don't see any? Okay, I should send those separately. And this is just a list of, all it is, it's a list of NSF grants that seem to lend themselves very well to using non-public data. And then, of course, another advantage is that the Atlanta Research Data Center pays for an on-site research assistant that is a public good that you would be able to add to your project if that would be useful to you, to have somebody in Atlanta run a program and tell you, it converged, it didn't converge. They couldn't talk to you about numbers or anything over the phone. But you may go down to Atlanta, set up the data, and get a program set up, and then once it finishes running, you could talk to them over the phone. They could restart the program again, changing a few parameters or whatever. So that some people find that very useful. All right, so now I'll get into some of the nitty-gritty. I'm not going to talk about each one of these data sets in detail because there are just way too many of them. But these economic censuses are conducted every 5 years, every year ending in a 2 and a 7. And they ask a series of similar questions of all establishments that are surveyed, such as revenues and number of employees and that sort of thing. And then they also ask a series of industry-specific questions. And so the census of manufacturers are going to be asked questions perhaps about energy usage. Census of finance, insurance, and real estate will be asked about things about access to loans or things like that. So they'll have some specific questions to that industry. The National Employer Survey down at the bottom is a survey that is sponsored by the Department of Education, and it asks employers about training of workers. And so, what sort of information about worker training. I guess that's the main point there, and it's a very good data set to get information about things like that.
So let me ask one question.
Yes.
So if I want to know the questions that were in the National Employer Survey,
Right.
how would I go about finding them?
So that is a very good question. And basically, this is a good point to point out, that doing research, and this will come up again, in the RDC is challenging. Okay? And one of the things that makes it challenging is that there are no data dictionaries for anything except really the LEHD data. And so many of these surveys that are done, the surveys themselves are publicly available. So you would Google National Employer Survey questionnaire. And so you would find that, I expect. Certainly Census of Manufacturers questionnaire. So then you would see the types of questions that are asked. If you can't get it by Googling, then you would contact the administrator as you're developing a proposal. It's like, you know what, let me also point out that on the website of the Federal Statistical Research Data Center, there's a lot more detailed description of each of these data sets. So you'll get some rough idea of the type of data that are in each of these. But if you need more detail about a particular variable that is essential to the research question you're asking, then the census administrator who works in the ARDC would be able to get that information for you, or put her hands on the questionnaires themselves if you can't find them publicly. Are you Googling it for me, Stephen?
Yeah.
You find, did they come up?
I haven't found this question.
Okay. Another question?
So I just want to make sure that I understand. So I could have a person that I know, let's say, lived in New Orleans before Katrina.
Yes.
And then that person has an was in some census,
Yes.
has an identifier, and I could see where they went to work. Also, if their employer, for example, went out of business in 2 years.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. And that's probably best. In fact, some people have used LAHD to track Katrina victims in that way, exactly. Yeah.
I have a separate question, very high level. So you talk about the proposal and everything. If Tulane were to get access to this data set, is it possible to just spend a day at the center just looking at the different data, or do you need to have a proposal in order to access specific data sets?
Yes, you have to have a proposal to actually look at any data. And not only do you need to have a proposal, but you have to become a special sworn employee of the Census Bureau. So, and I'll talk about those details, those steps in a little bit. Yeah. But to develop the proposal, so one of the things that the census administrator does most in her job is help people write proposals. So you are not out there on your own. Basically, you start by sending her a paragraph or two and say, look, this is the research question. This happens a lot. I was presenting this paper at a conference and someone told me I needed to use RDC data, and they said that I needed to get these variables and I could look at this question in much more detail. And so then she would be able to help you sort of transition into doing that research.
And when you write, you might talk about it, but when you write a proposal, if you access, like, let's say, specific, like, the assistant told you
Yes.
3 data sets that are relevant, and you're there and you figure out, well, I need also this variable. Do you need to first amend the proposal to access an additional data set, or are they flexible?
Oh, so once you get in there, you're saying you figure something else out?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, no. You don't need to list every variable that you're going to use in your analysis.
Okay.
You need to make a case for why this data set is going to be useful for your research. You may find more variables, more controls in the data that would be useful for your analysis. As long as you stay within the framework of your original research question, you can use any of the data that you have access to. Okay? If you want to bring in data from outside that you did not mention in your proposal, then you have to make a case for why that's important, additionally to, and why you didn't mention it the first time. Good questions. All right. Let me go ahead and go through some of these others. So other establishment level data, for example, the MEPS insurance component is at the establishment level. And the Federal Reserve actually sponsors the quarterly survey of plant capacity utilization. So the Census Bureau does these surveys for other agencies. And so a number of these are provided for through other organizations. So the Environmental Protection Agency sponsors the survey of pollution abatement, for example, and the that's it. Okay. That's all that I wanted to mention on that page. And then data, so those are data that were at the establishment level. So as you know, you might know that that a firm may have a number of different establishments. And the establishment is going to be the smallest entity at which these data are available in the economic data. And then there are some data that might be only available at the firm level, which means it's sort of a sum or a combination of all the establishment information. Now, for a single establishment firm, this is also at the establishment level. But here we have things like the Capital Expenditure Survey. This is a real popular one. This is the Business Research and Development Innovation Survey. This is sponsored by the National Science Foundation, so it has information about grants and things like that. Survey of Business Owners. Kaufman Firm Survey. This is an outside private organization that started a panel survey of new firms, of brand new firms. What year did they start? 2004, 5,000 startups, and in order to merge these data, this firm level data with other census products, they have to be used inside the RDC. Other data that are made available, these are the transactions microdata. So the commodity flow survey is particularly useful for supply chain management research. So if you're interested in where firms get their inputs from and where their sort of intermediate products go to in order to create a final product, this commodity flows, it's sort of like where commodities are going from one firm to the other. All of the foreign trade data are made available from the U.S. Customs Bureau, or sponsored by that's where they're from actually, is the Customs Bureau. And so you get transactions data between domestic and foreign firms on trade. Okay, so the business register microdata. So this is the backbone of all of the economic data. You get from the business register and the LBD, these are like the white pages of all businesses ever, they're in the United States. And so this, the Standard Statistical Establishment List, it has, I think it's the one that has the, it's got the name and the address of all businesses plus the census establishment ID, so that if you're bringing in outside data of establishment names and addresses, then you would link it to the Standard Statistical Establishment List to get that census ID that then could be linked to other census data sets. So these data are all populated from Internal Revenue Service tax returns, and so they're among the most highly sensitive data. Yes.
And if I write a proposal for a particular data set and I get it, can I use the data set for a different project or to write a proposal again?
You would have to write a new proposal for another project. But having seen the data, this happens a lot. New ideas come to you, and you probably would have a much easier time writing that second proposal because you actually know what's in the data, right?
What's the time frame between writing a proposal?
We're going to get to that. It's not overnight. That's for sure. Let me give you, but I definitely will be getting to that for sure. And it varies depending on what data you're trying to use. All right, so here's just one example of some research that was done using economic data. The surprisingly swift decline of U.S. manufacturing employment, published in the American Economic Review in 2016. So these authors used the longitudinal business database to look at how a change in trade policy is affected by different tariffs and how the employment was affected in each of those industries when tariff increases on Chinese imports. Trade policy eliminated the threat of tariff increases. So as trade became more free with China, it created a huge employment loss for some industries that were more heavily affected by those tariffs. Anyway, being able to see the trade that was going on in each of the industries allowed them to do this project. Let me talk a little bit about the demographic data that are available. Each of the decennial censuses going back to 1970 are available, and right now, and this is the people have been clamoring for a long time, and I have heard noise that this will be allowed sometime in our lifetime. But right now, you cannot link between each of the decennial censuses. So I told you that the personal identification key is available for each person that enters into the RDC, but you're not allowed to link. I mean, you could technically do it, but you're not allowed to propose any project that would rely on linking across decennial censuses, which completely boggles my mind, but they know people want to do that, so I expect that will be coming. The American Community Survey, the long form of the decennial census ended in 2000, I think. 2000, yeah, I think it was 2000, and it was replaced by the American Community Survey. And so this is the most complete demographic, large demographic data set in the United States. The Current Population Survey is a very popular survey used publicly, and certain supplements are available in there. The Survey of Income and Program Participation is a popular one and is often linked with Social Security Administration data. the American Housing Survey, the National Crime Victimization Survey. This is one that caught my eye recently because they just added a supplement. Getting ahead of myself, sorry. Yeah, 2011, the new Public Police Contact Survey for this National Crime Victimization Survey they added in 2011, collecting information on the perception of police behavior and response during encounters. What I would expect would be quite interesting in our current environment, political environment. The National Longitudinal Mortality Study is also available and linked with the CPS. So that if you get from the CPS a whole bunch of demographic information about somebody, maybe where they lived, and then you also know when and where and how and why they died. Other demographic data, again, like I said, I'm not going to go in great detail because there's a whole bunch, and probably more than you can find out on the website. National Survey of College Graduates. This one, it's not picked now. So this is a data set that they should be picking, I think. Because of course everybody wants to know when you graduate from college, what your major was, what classes you took, and then follow you through perhaps some of the other census data to find out what your earnings are, what your career progression was, and that sort of thing. Well, we can't do that right now because they don't have to pick assigned to them. But these are data that should be picked at some point, I'm hoping. The Census Nubitant file. This is a data set that contains all the information that is on your application for a Social Security number. And so it's most importantly what people use it for is where you were born. And some people are using this to look at environmental conditions, where you were born, and sort of what your health outcomes were later on in life. It has your parents' names, both mother and father, and other things, your birth date, I guess, of course. The Social Security earnings files, these of course have been used quite extensively as well. These contain, there's various files in these earnings files that are available. There's detailed earnings records of everybody in the United States from 1978 on, summary of earnings records. This is just all earnings every year, I guess, since that time. Beneficiary file. So this is if you're a recipient of Social Security type of benefits, that would be on there. And then I don't know what this is, but it's the 831 disability file. And it determines eligibility for disability insurance and SSI. So there's a lot of, these are part of the administrative data records that are quite powerful. And then housing data. The Housing and Urban Development administrative data has information about tenant rental assistance, computerized home underwriting management system, which I know people who are in that field think is very exciting, and the information about public Indian housing data. An example of research using the demographic data is one that was published in the AER in 2016, linking the Survey of Income and Program Participation and the SSA earnings records to examine the earnings gap associated with marriage for cohorts of women between 1936 and 1975. And they found that among women who work, the marital earnings gap has all but disappeared. So it used to be that married women earn less than married men or single women. But in contrast, the motherhood earnings gap remains large even for recent cohorts. So married women earn as much as single women, but if you have children, there ends up being this gap. And a lot of that from research of my own, I know, is because of time spent out of the labor force as well. But anyway, they were able to follow a large number of women over time to come to this conclusion. All right, so the LEHD data set, this is the huge longitudinal employer household dynamics data set that links individuals to their place of employment. And this is based on the unemployment insurance record. Every quarter, employers have to submit to their state's departments of labor a record of every person they paid money to in every month during that quarter, how much they paid, and that person's social security number. And so that data gets sent to the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor is required, and the purposes are for administering the unemployment insurance system, so that if you get laid off, then the state Department of Labor knows how much unemployment insurance you should be getting and how much to tax the employer for their layoff behavior. Anyway, so these records go to the federal, are required to be sent to the U.S. Department of Labor every year. Maybe they do it every quarter, but anyway, they end up with all the data in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the Census Bureau has it, and they've linked it all together, and they've added addresses from tax records on individuals, so not only do you know where the person works, you know where the person lives. You can do a lot of research about networks, about who you live with, and you can also look at commuting types of decisions and patterns. We have quarterly data starting in 1990, and it's available on a state-by-state basis. All of the states have a right to say, you can't use my data for research. There is a significant number of states that give a blanket okay, but it depends on what states you want, and the administrator will be able to help you know whether you could get the states you want. As an example, this paper looked at human capital loss in corporate bankruptcy. They quantify human capital loss in bankruptcy by estimating employee wage losses that are induced by bankruptcy. So they look at filings and bankruptcy filings. They find that annual wages decline by 30% 1 year after bankruptcy. So if you were working for an employer that was involved in a bankruptcy, your wages are on average 30% lower the next year. They use an external database on bankruptcy filings that they bring into the RDC. They merge it with the business register, which gives them the establishment link, and then they link the firms with their respective workers using the LEHD data to see how those workers fared over time. All right, so I know a lot of people here are interested in health data. It's probably the data sets that I know least about, but I've got a lot of slides on them. So these are data that are collected by two health agencies, the National Center for Health Statistics and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. These two health agencies have a dual mission. They want to provide broad access to health data, but they also need to protect the privacy of their respondents to the surveys. The Atlanta Research Data Center, and really this should say the Federal Statistical Research Data Center, hosts the data. These are not data that are archived or held by the Census Bureau, but once an individual has gotten a project approved with the agencies, the data that they've gotten approved is now put into their project space with the Census Bureau. The researcher works directly with the health agency to develop the proposal and to get the data that they need in order to do their research project. Here's all the data from the NCHS that are available through the RDCs. The National Health Status Surveys, there's several of them. The National Health Care Surveys, so it's the surveys of those providing the health services, including the National Immunization Survey, which the Atlanta RDC helped. The CDC came into the Atlanta RDC to help work on that National Immunization Survey. And then vital statistics are also available through the NCHS data.
Are all this data, like for example, the hospital discharge and ambulatory care?
Yes.
Can we all link them for a patient?
It depends on what it is that you want to link. So I'm not exactly sure. I was under the impression that these are individual level data sets, and so I don't know if, well, wait a minute, hang on. Okay, so here's some slides that is a slide that tells you what linked data sets are available. So maybe you can't just take anything that's in here and link it with something in Census, because they would need to provide the PIC, the personal identification key, and they may not have done that for all of these data sets. So
I'm familiar with the Medicare claims and how we can link, but for example, the hospital discharge survey.
yeah. So you said the Medicaid claims?
Yeah, so on the next slide, you have the Medicare enrollment.
Medicare enrollment.
That I know is linked by the same patient identifier.
Okay.
But right now, they are not providing anything about, Medicare is not about the hospital discharge.
I see, okay, okay.
So,
Yeah, and I can't answer that question, but it would be easily found out. And primarily, and I guess the reason we have less information on these guys, at least me anyway, is that we don't get involved in the development of the proposals. So I'm not as familiar with the types of things people have been allowed to do. But they have done some linking for you already. And these data sets. Yeah, so linking the EPA data has been real popular for people in terms of trying to link between environmental conditions and health issues. And they've linked Social Security Administration data with the National Institute of, the NHIS, the survey, National Health Interview Survey as well. Mortality, okay. The AHRQ data. So the AHRQ data is where MEPS comes from, and MEPS are pretty popular. They have all of these components: the household, provider, insurance, employer, and so it has to do with medical expenditures. And the only the household and the provider component are publicly available to individuals. So to link up or to know exactly to get any additional information from say the insurance provision or the insurance provider, you would need to access the data through the RDCs. All right, so now we'll get into the nitty-gritty about how you actually do this. So that was the good news. Now we're going to the bad news. Yeah.
So the type of HRQ data, you say type, so does that mean that other data sets are also available? Because, for example, the HRQ, like they just released something at an aggregate level about health systems, I believe in 2016.
Okay.
And so, but it's at an aggregate level for each health system.
Okay.
Not for the individual members, for example.
Yeah.
So would that, although it's not listed on the, could that?
Yeah, I would expect so. Anything, right. So the good thing, even though I don't know as much information, the good thing about the health data is that they have a very well developed website about what is available in confidential data. The non-public data that you could have access to. So have you looked for it on the AHRQ website? I know NCHS is very, very good.
I've seen on the HRQ, for example, this health system at the aggregate level.
Yes.
They don't, but so if it was available through this, would they list it and just say it's non-public? Or would they not list it?
I'm not as familiar with the AHRQ. I know that the NCHS data would list everything that you could access. But they probably have a very easy way for you to find that out by calling the administrator. Yeah, exactly. But those are exactly the types of questions that would go directly to the agency themselves, because they're the ones that control those data. All right, so the first thing is you have to develop a proposal. And like I said, the very first step is that if you have an idea that there are some data here that you might want to use for a research project, the most efficient way to go about finding out if that is, if you really have to go to all the trouble, is to email the census administrator, Melissa Bansaf, and her contact information is on there at the end, with a paragraph or two about what your research question is and how and what data set you think might be useful in answering your research question. The guidelines for the NCHS and AHRQ proposals, and also now the BLS proposals, I haven't updated all my slides to include the BLS, are different than the Census Bureau. Those proposals are submitted to each of the agencies that will review them. So the Census Bureau will review all of the proposals for the demographic and the economic data, and any data set or any proposal that requires use of data that was provided by the IRS, then also has to go to the IRS for review. So this is why the timing question you asked earlier was it's a little bit depending on what you want. And then you need to obtain special sworn status. Foreign national has to have been in the U.S. for 3 years in order to be able to be granted special sworn status. But that's the only requirement.
You can develop a proposal.
Yes, during this time, yes. Yeah, so it's like you've been here for 2 years, get started on your proposal. By the time you're done, you could apply for special sworn status. Yes?
Is this, from which entry is 3 years? So I've been in the United States from 2003 through 2005. That's my first 2 years. And now I came in 2015.
Yeah. So that probably would be long enough. There's been, when this rule first came down, this has only been the last year. It used to be, we didn't used to have any rule about length of time. When we first heard about this, as the directors first heard about this, it was any 3 years. Now, well, hang on. Now, there is some suggestion that it has to be more continuous, but not necessarily completely continuous. So depending on, so you've been here for 2 years, and then you had some time previously. I don't know if the gap in between would be considered too long or not too long, but that is easily found out. And by the time you would have developed a proposal, you probably will have been here long enough from this point on, would be my, because you will have been here for 3 years recently. There is a one-time fee for NCHS and AHRQ data, and then there's another line in here that I didn't make it onto the slide, but the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, has also decided to follow this model of researchers paying for the data, the BLS data. So they charge, I think it's $4,000 per year to access BLS data. Okay? They have one person who requested that. So I'm not sure that they're going to find that very useful. Because as the directors, we've told the BLS, look, everybody's already paying to get in to use these data. This is a little bit, anyway, just it's going to feel a little bit ingenuous to then go ahead and charge them for data again. So they may change that model, but as of right now, the BLS is charging for their data.
What is the one-time fee?
So the AHRQ and NCHS charge a fee to extract the data. They build a data extraction for you. So whereas the Census Bureau, if you want to use the Census of Manufacturers you want to use these 20 variables in the Census of Manufacturers to answer this one research question, they don't go extract those 20 variables for you. You get the whole data set. So it's no cost to the Census Bureau to just make it available to your project space. The NCHS, you have to be very specific about what data you want from them. And they build the data extract. And so that's what that fee is for, depending on how much data you want and how much time it takes them to build the extract.
So the one-time fee is one-time fee for every time we want to extract that data?
Just for one project. So for each project, you need these data for this research project. They extract the data, make it available, and then you go do your regressions.
So if you need one more data, would they bill you again?
Yes, they probably would. It is on the order of like $1,500, roughly. There's variance in there, but it's not a huge amount. But it's not just pocket change.
And that's in addition to what Tulane would be paid?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and because of that, the directors are not happy about BLS model of charging for the data.
So do they charge even if you want to update the data set? I asked for the data and maybe 2 years later I want the updated set and they want to charge again.
Well, I don't know. I don't think they like people updating. They want you to go and do your research project. You have a research question. These are the data I need, and then by the time you get with the health projects, they're essentially done by the time you get to the RDC because you've had to develop in your proposal. They're very detailed, and you had to essentially run your regressions without the restricted data that you want, because all of the rest of the data are publicly available. But you may not have state identifiers, for example. But you've been able to demonstrate to them that you can answer this research question, and you would do it even better if you had the state identifiers. So you're pretty much done. So by the time you're asking for the data, you're essentially, there won't be any updates by the time you finish. That's what they're counting on anyway, I guess. Does that make any sense? Like if you wanted to come back 10 years from now and say, oh, I want to update this research project, yes, you would have to submit a whole new proposal. Okay. Let me give you more details. Oh, there's the BLS, requires an annual fee. All right, so how do you develop a census proposal? There are several criteria that need to be established in order for your proposal to be approved. First of all, you need to demonstrate a need for non-public data. And believe me when I say, if you don't need non-public data, you really don't want to have to ask for it. You need to demonstrate that you're going to maintain confidentiality. And basically all that means is that your output is going to be in the form of like regression, statistics, parameter estimates, that sort of thing, as opposed to tables of averages across many different dimensions. You have to emphasize the statistical models as opposed to tabular output, as I've mentioned. You have to demonstrate feasibility. So not only do you have to demonstrate the need for public data, you have to demonstrate that the public data are that you will be able to actually answer your research question with the data that you will have access to. You have to describe how your research project benefits census. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And this is a legal requirement of SIPC. And you also have to demonstrate scientific merit. So it has to be a valid research question. All right. So it's like if you've ever written a research proposal for external funding, it's essentially what you're doing here. Except there's these little pieces where, I need this non-public data for this reason, and I'm benefiting the Census Bureau here. You will work with your administrator, the census administrator, to craft the final proposal. Okay, this is not something that you're left there out on your own. And she is very good. Our administrator, if I may say so myself, although I don't hire her, she's a Census Bureau employee. She is very good at getting proposals accepted. We've had only one proposal, we've had two. Mine was not accepted, but she was very young. But then I went back and got another one. But the second proposal that we did not have approved was one she knew was not going to be approved. And she warned us ahead of time. She says, there's nothing more I can do to help these researchers. And there's no reason not to submit it. And so the Census Bureau was very specific in why they didn't approve it. They revised it and it got approved. So that's generally the process. But that's only happened twice with us. The benefit to census, we have 13 benefits that the Center for Economic Studies provides for you to see whether or not your project satisfies these benefits. And one of the benefits is basically learning more about the population in the United States. Okay, so it is not it's not a trivial requirement, but it is not a difficult one to fulfill because the administrator helps you tremendously in identifying how your project will benefit the Census Bureau. So it's not anything to sweat over. All right, more of the bad news. All of the research that you do has to be done physically in the RDC lab. So some of us might be old enough to remember when you actually had to leave your dorm room to go to the computer center to run your regressions. All right, not many of you, but that used to be the way that it was. Well,
Carrying cards.
Yeah, or carrying cards and not tripping. Yeah, don't drop those. Exactly. Yeah, I was right there with you. The data are located on a server in Maryland. They are not in Atlanta. They are not in Boston. They are in Maryland, and you access those data through these thin terminal clients that are connected to the servers in Maryland. The thin server clients work on a Linux operating system with a Windows interface, and so it's there's a learning curve, but it's not terrible. All of the software that you might need should be available to you. So these are some of the common ones: SAS and Stata, R, MATLAB, word processing, which is really horrible, but it works fine. Because basically they're using free software as much as they possibly can. So all of the, the Excel and the Word, they got the free versions on there. TaxSim, GIS software, and Sudan, whatever that is. Now, if there is some software package that you need in order to do the analysis, then there is a process by which you can get that software made available to you. There's no internet access or personal computers allowed in the lab. We have, okay, I'll go back. Okay, so there's no internet access or personal computers in the lab. No paper or output is allowed outside of the lab. Each project has a locker inside of the lab that you put your output and your notes and your whatever. There's a printer, you can print things out, and you just leave everything in there. And you don't talk about any of the data outside of the lab with anybody. Yeah?
If you cannot bring paper or output or anything outside, how are you supposed to include tables in your manuscript?
Right. So there is a process. This is also while your research is going on. Before anything is released, Census undertakes a review of that. It's a disclosure review. And it is reviewed for confidentiality, not content. The Census Bureau doesn't care whether your coefficient is positive or negative. They just care whether or not it is going to identify or compromise the confidentiality of the data. So no need to be concerned about that. Very stiff penalties if data are disclosed accidentally. We have nice pink pads to help you remember that pink paper doesn't go outside the RDC. And if you print anything, they're on nice golden, not been disclosed paper, anyway, out of the administrator's office. So there's lots of things we try and do to help you remember that nothing goes outside of the RDC. We do have a non-restricted work area outside of the lab that has tables. There's an office that you can close the door and have a meeting with somebody if you need to. There's also lockers where you can lock up your personal items, your laptop, your whatever, outside as well. And that has a combination lock that you get for the day kind of thing. You also have internet. We also provide wireless connection for you outside the lab. And we also have a research assistant available, as I think I mentioned before. The consortium pays for a research assistant that's a public good and is not being overtaxed at the moment. I fully expected that our long-distance partners would be using this research assistant more than we had available. In fact, I was hoping to have 3 of them by now, but we still just have 1 research assistant, and he has spare time on his hands. So we're looking for users of that. All right, so here's the answer to your question about timing, right? Patience is a virtue. If you're only using census data, you should plan on 6 to 12 months from starting your proposal to getting in the lab, depending on other linkages, all right? If it's census approval only, if it's only Title 13 data, which is just, for example, only you need the American Community Survey, okay? Or my project, I only needed the decennial census and the March current population survey, and I was bringing in a data set. That only required census approval. I think I was in 4 months. Okay? Title 26 data are all the economic data, the LEHD data. Anything that the IRS has provided, has supplied information for those data requires at least another 2 or 3 months because the IRS has to approve the project. All of the health data, the BLS, the BEA data, it depends on the agency and their process. And it's often faster than the census data. A census approval is not required unless you're linking it with census data. I'm not sure why I said BLS not there yet. Okay. Oh, no, I don't know. Sorry. Yeah, I'm not sure what that meant. And then you have to get special sworn status. So this can be going on simultaneously with some of this. So for example, especially for the economic data, as soon as the Census Bureau has approved your project and they send it over to IRS to start working on their approval, or go to the states, and if you want the state approval for the LEHD project, you can get started on the special sworn status. And this takes at least 3 months. It's a very long. It's long, and you have to, put, your closest 100 friends on there to assure them that you're not on the take from foreign governments and things. Anyway, it's not horrible, but it's tedious.
Do you need the special sworn status renewed every time you start a new project?
No, the special sworn status lasts for about 7 years. So in fact, it could last beyond, for 2 projects.
So couldn't you just get the special, why do you need to wait until, for example, the census data is approved before starting, if it's not project dependent?
Well, you have to have a reason to have special sworn status. So you have to have an initial reason. So once you've got it, though, and if your project is complete, then they will collect your badge. I don't know if you end up in a limbo or something, but you could it could still be in place for your second project. And so the last slide has contact information that we would encourage you to make use of if you have additional questions. And then so this is what I'll make up in a separate handout to have emailed to everybody, just for your information. There are a lot of these are a lot of grants. These are just NSF grants. This is not like all the grants you could ever possibly apply for using these data. But these are the grants that I identified that look like they would be very relevant, or these data would be very relevant for getting. So there's 3 pages of these things, 2.5 pages of funding opportunities. Anyway, so I want to stop there. Oh gosh, we have gone into an hour, haven't we? So
Yeah, you're on a roll.
I know. Well, I have some good questions. So I want to make available.
We're going to see if we can bring anybody together.
Julie, can you distribute your slides electronically?
Yes, you did get them emailed, right? And we'll send them out to everybody or other people who might want them?
I would like to have them.
Sure.
I was speaking with Julie at lunch about the requirement for IRB approval if one uses these data. So the answer is it's institution dependent. So we have to discuss that with the Tulane IRB and determine how we're going to proceed. So that's why I need this.
Right, absolutely. Right, in terms of explaining the process, and if you need more information in more detail, let me know. I think, in fact, I may have more information from other institutions that have come to arrangements with their IRB.
That would be great. If you sent that to Katie, she'll share it with me. That would be great. I'd love that.
Let me get my pen. Use a pen and make notes. As I'm being asked these questions, I want to not forget.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
So is there anyone who called in that has a question for Julie?
They're overwhelmed.
Uh,
I am.
Maybe they're muted.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe.
Because I don't
Unmute.
They'll just come up whenever they have to ask a question.
We'll stop. Stick this through.
Oh, yes.
If this is a joint project with the co-author, if this is approved, then both of these people will have access to this data, right?
Yes.
Different times, like I can go some
You're
today,
welcome. Thanks for coming. Okay.
and then 15 days later, my co-author can go and run the integration.
Yes. So let me be clear. Is your co-author here at Tulane? Or
No, that was like
well, it depends. So right. So it depends. Any consortium member who is a co-author with another consortium member will have access to the to the same project space in Atlanta. You will both have access in Atlanta. If your co-author is in Boston and is a member of the Boston RDC, for example, they could go to the Boston RDC and work on your project. If you're, right now, for example, if your co-author is at LSU, who is not a consortium member, and Tulane is a consortium member, but they wanted to go to Atlanta, then as a co-author of a consortium member, they would have to pay $1,000 per project per year. Because of the fixed costs associated with having another body and processing them.
I'm sorry, they were asking about, so you go do the research and you can't get anything out. So you prepare your tables there?
Yes.
And they go to review
Yes.
within the same center and they say, okay, then you go back home and write your paper?
Yes, they will. So the whole process, in fact, I've just gone through this, and it is, you have to plan ahead, okay? They will take at least 2 weeks to get it out. And typically that's because they will have questions, or you will have forgotten and put 5 digits instead of just 4, or you haven't rounded your number of observations, or something like that. Or you have to describe every sample that you've used, and you provide the means of all of the sample that you've used so that they'll see that when you put a dummy variable in to describe a certain age and race categories, that you don't end up with just one person in one of the categories. Things like that. They look at those. You may not be wanting to disclose that particular crosstab, but they look at it to make sure that, I don't know, but that they want to see those kinds of things. That's why it takes 2 weeks. So you put your tables together as output, and then you have a disclosure memo that you describe all of your samples. You describe, you make your programs available, and you make that available to the disclosure officers. They review everything, and then they send you an email that has all of your output in it. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, I don't know what they look for, but having gone through it using the demographic data, it's all about sample sizes, and usually you don't have a problem because in the demographic data you've got a whole lot of data. The economic data, when you're disclosing economic data, they've got special programs that you need to run on your samples to make sure that no one can be identified. Something like that.
Is the access date on a daily basis? I mean, for example,
It's 24/7.
okay.
24/7.
So if something you have to do more and you need to stay one more day.
Oh yeah. You don't have to. So there are things. So the administrator lets people know if, like, oh my God, the server's down, or we do. There's maintenance the last Tuesday of every month between 6:30 and 10:30 in the morning, or something like that. So those kinds of usual things you work around. But when you come to work in the RDC, no one is. You don't have to make an appointment.
I see.
Yeah, you don't have to make an appointment. You just come and you work. We are not capacity constrained at this time. At most, I've seen maybe 6 people in there. We have 10 workstations. And so, it's not a problem.
Apologies if you covered this earlier, came from another meeting, but I see there's a couple of locations in Texas.
Yes.
It sounds like your answer to Korai about in the Boston example, it's not as if you're a member of one that you can show up to any of them. You have to show up to the one you're a member of.
That's correct.
Okay.
And each of the RDCs have their own fee structures. For example, the Northwest RDC in Seattle allows graduate students to access the RDC for free, but they make all of the faculty have an external grant to pay for that includes the RDC in their grant to access it. So now, but we provide. So for example, if you do have a researcher, say at LS, No, you have somebody in Boston, for example, that's already paying into an RDC system, all right? Then, but they're going to be spending the summer in Atlanta, or they're going to be just coming with you. They're going to be in Atlanta for a couple of days. You know, we just let someone come in and use the lab. It's not that big a deal. If they're going to be there an extended period of time, like all summer long, then we probably would charge them just a small fee to process their access, because it's not a trivial thing at the Fed.
Then, second question is, I'm particularly interested in the linked healthcare data sets.
Yes.
I looked online, I saw some of the data sets, and I don't quite have a great understanding of what is the extra resolution of data that you get from some of these data sets. Do you have just like a tabular list of variables that this additionally includes?
So I don't, but were you looking at the NCHS data?
Yeah.
Okay, they have a fabulous website. Oh, that's so nice. Are they calling?
That was someone, yeah.
But anyway, the NCHS has a really fabulous website that tells you exactly what variables are available, both publicly and through the RDC. So so I couldn't tell you exactly, but I do know that's like the best data to use, because in terms of accessibility and knowing before you go in what's there.
Great.
Yeah.
What about ARC? Is that true for ARC as well?
I haven't played around on that data set as much, but my understanding is it is, and is that it is much better than the other data sets. But if not, we could help you find out who you need to ask those questions of. But I'm afraid I'm less familiar even with the HRQ data. Yeah. Sorry about that.
So, but right now, we're still not allowed to access. Tulane still has to decide whether we will become a member, and you decide whether you accept Tulane.
Oh, we'd probably accept you. So, we're not, but you need to.
The weather was so good today.
Yeah, the weather was great. So let me be clear. So I always feel like a used car salesman or something when I come to talk to people, because I'm not really trying to sell something, except that I am, in the sense that I just want to make you aware of a resource that's available through the Federal Statistical Research Data Center, okay, generally across the U.S. Atlanta happens to be the most easily accessible current location to y'all right now. If there are enough people here at Tulane that would be willing to undergo and to overcome the hurdles that I have explained to use the data, we would love to have you come and use the data in Atlanta. Absolutely. The fees that each of the RDCs charge primarily go to pay for the census administrator that manages the lab. We pay their full salary plus an overhead to the Census Bureau. So those are the money that we recover, plus the fixed costs of just having extra bodies and processing access to the lab itself. So that's one thing that you guys as researchers need to decide, is whether or not you feel like you could do research in this kind of environment, or if the research that you want to do is important enough to overcome those hurdles.
Part of the reason we invited Julie was just to make the information available to see what the interest was across the campus, and also to give a realistic idea of what's involved and what resources are available.
Yeah, and I don't want to talk you out of it either, but I do want you to think about it with open eyes.
Just out of curiosity, how much is the institutional fee that Tulane would be paying to access?
I'll start at the highest cost to the less cost. Any researcher who wants to access data in the Atlanta RDC and they're not affiliated with any consortium member, it's $20,000 per project per year, and that covers 2 researchers. Any institution that becomes a consortium member that is within 100 miles of Atlanta, it costs $34,000 per year, and that covers anybody associated with that institution who wants to use it. Since Tulane is more than 100 miles away, they would only have to pay 75% of the cost, because we figured you'd be using it less. And that would be $25,500. would be your cost
Per year, right?
per year.
For everybody.
For everybody, for anybody.
Besides that, they have to pay every time you want to.
Yeah. So now, they're also, right, so for health data, there's a data extraction fee. For the BLS data, there's this annual $4,000 fee. But that's to that agency. We don't touch that data at all.
Those are relatively, except for the.
Yeah, those are
Small time.
those are easily recoverable from research grants. I mean, that shouldn't be a problem.
It's, so you mentioned a lot, one type of data with one source, but not the HRQ. For the HRQ, so I've looked many times on their website, and they seem to pretty much make any data available for money, and so I'm interested in knowing which data does your center offer that the HRQ does not offer, because typically the data they offer is also around like $1,500.
Yes.
Like this.
So that I do know the answer to. I know the answer to something. Health data. Here we go. Oh, here we go. So the HRQ data has all of these modules. Oh, I can't do that. Okay. Has the medical expenditure panel survey has like the household component, the provider component, and those two are available through AHRQ directly. Some of the provider component. The insurance employer component is only available, so all the rest that I'm going to list are only available through the RDC. Insurance employer component, the nursing home component, which apparently is only available in 1996. The area resource file, which is information about like demographics of the areas, I guess. And I don't know how fine that goes. If it's like where the patient lives, right, or where they're being county level, or it may be even. So this is where the area may be much smaller for the public for RDC data, but I'm not sure about that. The 2-year panel file. And I don't know what these things are, I just have the list that's available in RDC.
Well, they have identifiers for a survey period, which is a 2-year period. So do they have identifiers that will go between survey periods?
I don't know. Well, is someone just included in the survey 2 years at a time?
They provide that in the public.
I see. So maybe you can link across the 2 years then perhaps. That would make sense to me. That would be a value, yeah. And then they have a linked data, the MEPS and the National Health Interview Survey is linked. And it's available, that's what's available in RDC.
Okay. Why don't we bring it officially to a close? I know some of you will be talking to Georgia a little later. If you haven't signed in, please sign in so I have to be able to list who's there. I know who's supposedly called in. I got other people who have expressed interest as well. And be sure to pick up these handouts. And if anyone wants it electronically, just contact me and we can send it out. Okay? Thank you very much.
Great.